All right. We're officially live through Restream. Cassie, do you want to introduce the name and concept of our new podcast?
Sure, Jerry. And there may be a slight delay, so I may pause after you talk just to try and fix that. So we've been talking on and off for a year or so about doing some sort of, collaboration together. And I had an idea while I was walking my dogs, like what would the concept of that be? And I wanted to play around with like a very old meme that's very similar to TikTok in a lot of ways called All Your Base Are Belongs. I'm definitely showing my age because that is from I'm an Xer and that's really old. But anyway, it's a play on a video game that in really bad translation, a bad guy told the people in the game, all your base are belong to us. And if you go Google it, you can find the video. Like it's really great. But play it on that a little bit with all your data are belong to us because we're definitely living in a space now where who owns what data is out there, new sources of data. We're living in a data economy, and so it seemed like the perfect kind of vibe, and also all things kind of cyberpunk and old retro is kind of, you know, definitely in style now. So I think it just kind of like segues well together. So allyourdata.io is the website, and All Your Data is our podcast name.
Yeah, I love this as a vehicle for us, and it's a way for us as a duo to share information in our respective areas. Data is like an ingredient for so many different recipes, and the recipe that I look at is forensics. That's my recipe. And I guess yours is legal as an attorney, right? Um,
Right. Legal. Yeah, definitely.
so I think we're like chefs in our own little subject matter areas, but looking at very similar or overlapping uh, data domains. I look at um, these days a lot of AI. I was a data analytics consultant for many years, doing more proactive consulting around detection and prevention of fraud and misconduct. And so that's where I became familiar with just statistics and statistical modeling. And, that's been around for decades.
Right.
And the concept of AI has been around for that just about as long, but it hasn't reached, I think, this kind of potential where we're crossing the chasm of the uncanny valley and the Turing test to, you know, um, see that AI is very human-like these days, and it could be indistinguishable from human output. And I think that's
Hmm.
what we're on the verge of today.
It's really interesting, Jerry. Whenever like 20 more than 20 years ago, I was studying abroad at a University of Canterbury, and I was taking some classes about AI as represented in sci-fi films. Like, how funny is that? And each class we watched a sci-fi movie, and there wasn't a textbook. We just read a series of articles that kind of tied in with the theme of that movie. And one of the articles talked about the more we rely on technology, the more we kind of associate more and more with our pets. Like we humanize our pets, and so we see that happening. That's just like an interesting kind of other area to think about, like how technology affects in our daily lives. And so I really wish I had like all those materials I read, because I think it would be really interesting to read it 20 years later and see how that's progressed over time. But
Yeah, it does kind of, remind us of the past, and I think that's where it all kind of coalesces. There's something about our past and our academic studies, and things that you thought you'd never use again, but it's still there. It's lingering, and
mhm.
now we can apply it to our everyday lives and to our work. It's funny. I'm using ChatGPT, which is the chatbot implementation of OpenAI's GPT 3.5, and I find myself interacting with it and having really long chat dialogue, and I actually end up saying please. I have all these. I'm actually, being I'm being polite to a chatbot,
Hmm.
which
Yeah,
is
I
really
we
weird.
definitely have that in our home with an Alexa device. And my parents live with us, and they moved in with us, right, my husband and I, right before COVID hit by chance. And we definitely got them set up with one, and we're always like, Alexa, thank you. How are you doing? Are you having a good day? And it's we're definitely humanizing them a little bit. So, but maybe it's easier to do
But
that because it's a little dot. So,
ChatGPT though puts Siri and Alexa to shame. Like
yeah.
I'm just when I end up using Alexa and Siri nowadays, it's so disappointing on how limited it is, because
Hmm.
ChatGPT has opened up vast stores of knowledge at my fingertips. I actually have apps on my phone, and that's the key because I think most people are interacting with ChatGPT through the browser. Once you figure out how to get it on your phone, that's that's a huge difference because um, you know it's on your phone. You interact with a lot of different apps on your phone, and when you have that at your fingertips, you're not Google searching anything anymore for answers.
Right.
You're using a chatbot.
Well, and interestingly enough about Google searching, I've seen it in articles all over that, like, TikTok is being used by Gen Z for Google searching. So I think, this kind
Yeah,
of progression that we're talking about, it makes a lot of sense. So I don't know. It's interesting time to be alive, that's for sure. So
yeah, and the format we wanted to use for all your data and these Friday podcasts is, I think, quickfire topics.
mhm.
This is just a
Yeah.
test run, but I mean, for anyone listening in or um, hearing this on playback, it's really to do quick chats. Yeah. What's the format?
Oh,
If you don't mind sharing
yeah.
with the audience.
Yes. So we're calling it Bowie and Burns Take Five, kind of falling
Yeah.
under the umbrella of all your data. And what we want to try and do is have weekly podcasts with Jerry and I, where we're picking 5 topics each week that we're going to talk about, and we're going to spend a couple of minutes on the front end doing quick intros, and then we're going to try and stick to we have 5 topics and we're going to talk 5 minutes each, and then we'll close it. So that's kind of what we're wanting to play around with. It doesn't take too much time to come up with. It'll probably be him and I just messaging each other at the beginning of the week. These are the things I want to talk about. These are the things I want to talk about, and we'll pull together a list and kind of just share with everybody, and maybe create some other fun things around that to kind of tie in all together. But it won't just be about necessarily generative AI or blockchain or anything. I think it could be, what books are we reading, or what shows, TV shows are we watching, or what's an old documentary I watched a while ago that kind of ties back into this. So a little bit of a pop culture, aspect of it as well to kind of, add a little bit more flavor to it.
Yeah, and I think that's just our style, is trying to be authentic and humanize a lot of these um, topics that we talk about. There is always kind of an underlying tech and data theme to it, but it's not just gonna. I mean, it's not just gonna all be about work and no play. So we do intend to have
Right.
it fun. I think it'll run 30 minutes max every Friday.
Right. Right. And we may do other things, under the umbrella again of all your data, but this is kind of something we wanted to do to kind of kick it off with a low, threshold to get it started. Cause, you know, it may be hard to believe, but Jerry and I are doing this in our free time. And we're kind of, I know I am just like, oh, I have a thought. Let me just throw it out there on LinkedIn. So it's kind of along that vein. We're just tied to we're trying to stay committed to at least a time where we do lives. So
It's really for us personally a way to get everything kind of bottled up in our head out in the open, and Cassie and I are really good sounding boards for one another. So others might not be as interested or as bored, but I and get bored, but it's um it's a outlet, I think, at the end of
mhm.
the day, because we're always like trying to not just do our daily work, but look, we think bigger picture. I consider ourselves thought leaders, even though that might have a bad connotation. But we do really try to put practical implications of some of these thoughts. And sometimes you'll find those thoughts and meanderings on our Twitter accounts, our LinkedIn posts, our Instagram posts, but certainly, rather than just talking into a void, it's a way for us to um,
Right.
bounce off of each other, because we're both so similar minded in that way, and we're always building up topics. We're thinking about all variety of topics. So I don't think
Mhm.
there's going to be a shortage of content for this podcast.
Absolutely not. No. I mean, I think that there's just so much interesting, stuff going on that we could talk about. And I think that a lot of the tech, there is some surface level discussion going on, but sometimes it gets like maybe too technical. And that's definitely what we don't want to do here. We just really want to touch on,
Yep.
the possibilities or a gut check of like, okay, there's fear mongering here or too much hype there, just sort of, our kind of like, we're both Gen Xers. I think we're both, very similar in our approach to things. So, yeah, that's kind of the thought. And I think it's also we're both in Texas, in the middle of the country. We're not, in a hub of fun. We're not in New York City where fun stuff is happening all the time. We're not necessarily in LA where fun stuff is happening, or San Francisco or Miami. So, just really encourage, I think, other people out there who would like to create content, but they feel kind of inhibited for whatever reason. And this is really just like us, taking a leap of faith and just putting ourselves out there, and anyone can do it. You don't have to, I think as long as you have something interesting to say, people want to hear. Or the approach I always take is, well, it's really interesting to me. So obviously everyone else has got to think it's interesting. Like,
I
gosh,
do. I think it's
I'm
interesting. That's
myself
why we're
all the
doing.
time. So,
That's why we're doing this. And I think once we get into a rhythm, we'll start to get comfortable with the Q&A part of this application or this platform. We're using Restream to kind of simulcast our podcast to a lot of different platforms. So once we get comfortable with the tech and working with the chat window, like while we're talking, I'm trying to search for the chat window and I can't find it, but it should take in any chat comments or questions that y'all have from the various platforms that we're connected to, whether that's LinkedIn or Twitter or Instagram or Facebook or YouTube. Restream, supports all those platforms, but we'll get used to that. And then ultimately we'll get to a point where we can support additional guests as well.
mhm.
But just bear with us while we get into a rhythm and kind of put ourselves into this new format. I mean, we're pretty consistent on social media, but taking it to a live podcast like this is a whole nother level. So I think we'll get good with it eventually.
I think we will. I have, and maybe we can get some help from some AI friends or something like that.
Oh,
So,
interesting. Yeah, AI guess would be on brand for all your
yeah.
data. Yeah.
Yeah, have you ever engaged or followed an AI influencer? Because I know they're out there. I
The,
mean, I just
I
like
have
read
not.
articles. What do
Yeah.
you think about that?
I
Hmm.
think it'd be interesting. And with AI nowadays, it'll create not just the look and the personality and the voice of these AI influencers, but now they can create entire stories. Like when you think about what Chat GPT does, you
Hmm.
can instruct it to create stories. And I'm going to start doing this soon. Is telling it to create bedtime stories for the kids. So
I
quick
love that.
5-minute bedtime stories. It says so it's all called prompt engineering, and so there's a lot of tips out there. And one of the tips for creating custom bedtime stories for your kid is say act like a children's book author and or children's author and create a 5-minute bedtime story for me where um, the protagonist is are my kids. I
Oh my
can
gosh, I love it.
yeah, and then there's this villain, and we just finished seeing a movie last night um, called Ant-Man. I think it's
Okay.
called something like Travel
Mhm.
to the Quantumanium or something like that.
Okay.
But
Yep.
I can incorporate all those characters into the story, and they'll just be giddy with these custom stories because I did used to sit down and just make up stories off the top of my head
I love
when they
it.
were younger, and they missed that, and I've just honestly run out of ideas. I keep telling them the same giant rising from the mountains and fighting the dragon in the lake story. So it gets
I
pretty
love it.
redundant, and so they'll feed me some fresh new ideas. So that's the next thing I'm going to try, and I'll report back.
So there was some news today on around copyright law and AI generated content where there is someone who created a graphic novel using AI generated art, but the whole comic book, the whole graphic novel was
Ah,
submitted to the copyright office for like pre-blessing. Like, can this be considered authored content, copyright protected? And they said the book as a whole can, because it's that, again, that's showing, the artistic influence, the spark of creativity from the human. It has to still come from a human, but the
hmm.
individual pieces of art that were AI generated would not get copyright protection. So that's really interesting. But I think that's like a fun thing to play around with. I know I have a few NFTs where I have the rights to the underlying art to use in different ways, and I've thought about, like, maybe I could create a graphic novel with some of those images, some of that IP, and what fun thing could I come up with. So I think that it's interesting. I think it's not going to be AI alone is going to be it's, I've said this a million times, but it's just like Vermeer's having like this huge, like, the Rijksmuseum is having a huge, like, collective, as many Vermeers as they could have in one museum. It's happening this year. And some people believe Vermeer used a camera obscura, which is kind of like, a projector, to help paint. Now, does that mean his paintings are any less masterful? No, he still had to be very good at composition. He still had to be good at the actual aspect of painting. And I still think that at the end of the day, these AI tools we're seeing now, they're just like our camera obscura, our version of tech. Now, is it going to be a situation where, it's Skynet or whatever? I like to think that's not going to happen, but I could be wrong. It could be a definite Cylon situation, but maybe we're not there yet. Maybe we're like a couple hundred years away from that. So
Yeah, I think it's gonna be it's gonna reach a point where it's almost indistinguishable. What AI creates in terms of human art, and I'm blown away by some of the stuff that I see through generative art already, generative AI art through Midjourney, and in the hands of the right individual, man, they're like masterpieces. What's created, and as far as I know, they're completely unique and original. So I think that's a debate that we'll have, because I think once GPT-4 comes out and it's 100 trillion parameters, it's going to be more than we bargained for. Oh, and by the way, did you know that on Amazon now there are 200 books on Amazon where the author or co-author is listed as ChatGPT? So
interesting, very interesting. I
so
mean,
people are monetizing off of it, and I think to really kind of mitigate risk, or um, you know avoid any issues, they are including ChatGPT as part of that. I mean, those are the known ones where the 200 are listed. Who knows how many additional number of books, or I think they're mostly ebooks. How
mhm.
many number of those ebooks are actually aided by ChatGPT, or wholly written by ChatGPT, but the author who's monetizing doesn't divulge it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That there are people proactively listing ChatGPT as an author, because that it would be interesting to see how that plays out if someone were to challenge, the ability to claim copyright on that book. How much of that content was authored by ChatGPT versus the human, and it, and I think what we're going to see in copyright law. I mean, copyrights there's a spectrum, and sometimes they're, especially, I think we're going to see sometimes you see an infringement and concepts of like fair use, but at what point is there enough of the human input for it to be copyright protected? And how much of that is copyright protected? Like, so the graphic novel, for example, the book itself, the whole that is protected, but the individual photos aren't. So how do you deal with that, like in a book situation, and what are authors doing to maybe protect themselves to be able to say and defend themselves? Yes, I did use ChatGPT, but this is the stuff that I authored myself, and what sort of like breadcrumb trail or what sort of forensic evidence are they keeping to valid their own contribution to that piece. So
Yeah, and one topic that I plan to explore on a future podcast of ours is the digital forensics image is going to change dramatically. I think the composition of the data, where we separate it or delineate it by user-generated content, UGC, versus system-generated content. Often that system-generated content is excluded for any kind of preservation, processing, or review. Namely using the NIST list. So we de-NIST that data and exclude it. And how do we categorize AI generated data that's residing on anyone's devices or cloud data sources, right? Do you categorize that as user generated content? Do you categorize that as machine generated content, or do you consider it as half and half? Like, I'm sure there's going to be some specific ways that we can identify it through either file header analysis. I don't know if it's going to be a specific file extension, but once we identify it, how do we treat it going forward?
Right. Well, and that's sorry to cut you off, and that's assuming that you have AI generated content and it'll be used in its complete whole. But it's like jumping on Canva. I could use as something I upload, AI generated something, and then I integrate it into something I create, or it's like a compilation. So how do you put your finger on that AI generated content when it's 2 steps or 3 steps away from its actual original like native file, but it's been integrated into other things, or embedded into other things. So
yeah, and isn't that part of the consideration for copyrights? Is how much have you? I don't know the term of art there, but how much have you enhanced it?
Yeah, it's what is the oh gosh, I can't think. How much have you added to it? What's the additional added a derivative work? What it's derivative of something else. What is the added authored content that you've brought to that? So Sherlock Holmes is a good example. Sherlock Holmes is now in the public domain. You can write Sherlock Holmes. We could write about that. We could write a book with with ChatGPT maybe, or maybe not. But if you were to publish that book, or you were to make a movie or make a series like on Netflix, like you couldn't claim copyright on the character Sherlock Holmes. But if you created a new storyline, created new characters that were integrated into that world that was created by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, like that element of it would be protected. And someone who then tried to talk about Sherlock Holmes and the character you created, you could claim copyright protection or copyright infringement of that character. So.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I know. Is it 50 years where you lose the
75?
Okay.
75. But if it's, I can't remember what it is. If it's a corporate owned, it's a little bit different. So.
Okay. Yeah, because
that's be interesting. Oh, sorry to cut you off, Jerry. What were you going to say?
That's okay. No, I posted something recently on LinkedIn. I mean, a lot of platforms around a Twilight Zone episode. In fact, it was the very first Twilight Zone episode ever, the season 1, episode 1. And I know I looked this up because I wanted to be sure that I was okay using the footage. And it turns out it was out of it was either out of copyright protection or intellectual property protection. I can't remember, but and that's why I used it. And I think with a lot of like written works that were in the 1950s, you can start kind of repurposing that content now.
And that one may be like older school copyright law required you to register the copyright to be able to claim copyright protection, but that is not necessary. You just have to register to be able to bring an infringement lawsuit against someone. So there are instances before that change happened that they didn't register the mark, or they didn't, register the copyright, and they didn't get the protection. And another example of that is the movie Charade with Audrey Hepburn and I can't remember the guy, but anyway, so that might be what that situation was about, because we're like I think the first like Steamboat Willie Mickey Mouse, I think that's about to go out to public domain next year. So we're going to start like in the next like 10-15 years, there's going to be like some very heavy hitting IP that will come out as public domain, but it's that Steamboat Willie or that original iteration of Mickey Mouse or that original version that would be out out of copyright protection, but not the later versions of Mickey Mouse that we see now. So that,
Right,
that's when
right.
that derivative work and protection kind of comes into play.
Yeah, and I think there's people registering content when they didn't even create it, and then they're turning around and trying to get the original creator to pay them a fee. So that's happening online right now too. I think with some music that's being created on SoundCloud or something like that, they'll take that and go register it. It's almost like it's like those I can't remember those farms that'll just go and get patents. Those patent trolls will go and get patents and then turn around and sue the actual original creators. They were just first to consider the legal aspect of it, which is unfortunate.
Right.
So that's pretty rampant, and all the patent kind of abuse too is getting out of hand. I think they're limiting the creativity and innovation when it reaches that level, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I think, anytime there's a surge of technology, that's always an interesting discussion, I think, that starts happening. I mean, and it's kind of crazy to think about. There was a time when there was case law that had to be developed to show that, a photograph could be copyrighted. So technology is always challenging the bounds of intellectual property, and, maybe, the how heavily it's relied on, how ubiquitous it is, I mean, look at how much copyrighted material there is now compared to 150 years ago. I mean, people are just creating stuff constantly. We're creating photos all the time. We're creating, so much. So I don't know. It's interesting.
Yeah, and I'll as always, I'll take kind of the forensic angle. You usually take the legal angle. Before we wrap up, do you want to maybe touch on some other topics that we are likely to cover? I know we talked about a lot about AI on this first episode or this trial episode, but certainly we'll talk about metaverse, right?
We'll talk about metaverse. I think, and we'll talk about, I think, like AR, VR, as part of that, and then blockchain related things.
Mm.
That's something I know that we all like talking about. And something that catches my fancy, Jerry, that I think you and I have not talked about is space. I feel like there's a lot of conversations about space law, and
Mm.
I always kind of was like, that's weird, but there's a lot of data around, all of the satellites going up into space and the research that's going on up there. So that's something I'd like us to maybe dig into a little bit. I don't
Cool.
know.
Yeah, let's add that to the list. I want to talk about, since we're brainstorming here, I want to talk about synthetic biology.
Hmm.
So, we're talking a lot about digital synthetic media and synthetic digital items, but we're on the cusp of having synthetic biology, body parts and things like that being
And
created in the
CRISPR
lab.
and the
Yeah,
CRISPR
using
stuff, like messing with
ge-
your DNA. Hmm.
yeah, CRISPR genetics, but they're also creating synthetic meat, so lab grown proteins that
Mm,
are likely to replace our food supply. So we wouldn't depend on slaughtering animals anymore, but we just would. And it's synthetic meat in terms of like it is, at the chemistry level, actual meat, whether it's beef or protein or beef, pork or chicken. It tastes like it. It's essentially the same thing. It's
interesting.
like lab grown diamonds, right? We're not talking
Right.
moissanite like we're talking veggie patties, right? This is the real deal at the biological level or chemical level. It's just being simulated and synthetically created in the lab, and so that's going to have a major impact on society too. So it's a different kind of tech. We usually talk about the tech in the digital realm, but
Hmm.
I think that's something to also add to the list.
And maybe nanotechnology. I feel like nanotechnology was very like kind of like Internet of Things was very popular, I feel like 5, 7 years ago. Nanotechnology, I feel like was very popular 15 or so years ago. I'm
Yeah.
sure it's being worked on, and like where is that fitting into everything? So I think it would be interesting to pick up that thread again, I feel like.
Basically, like watch any sci-fi movie or read any sci-fi book, and you can kind of predict what's coming down the pike. Like the
Right.
pace of innovation is just incredible. And any of those things we thought were fanciful or imaginary are becoming real, and all within our lifetimes, which is, again, what's so great about being Gen X. It's because we're seeing all
Right.
this
We've
stuff
seen it
unfold from
all.
since the very beginning with the internet. So we existed at a time when there was no internet. I think that's
Right.
a claim to fame for Gen X, and we should weave in a lot of Gen X, I think, culture into our podcast, like movies and music and all that.
Absolutely. I'm down. There are some really great movies in the 90s, that the indie
Loved it.
movies that like are not on anyone's radar that I think we could dig into. So,
80s
absolutely.
movies. 80s movies are
80s
nice.
movies, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
What's your, just to close it out here? What's your number one favorite 80s flick?
I mean, I think anything, John Hughes related is going to
Hmm.
be way up there.
He did Ferris
Labyrinth.
Bueller's Day Off, right? Ferris
Oh
Bueller's
yeah.
Day Off.
Oh
16
yeah.
Candles.
I don't remember Ferris being absent 9 times. I mean, I can't hear the word nine without that rolling through my brain. So
I think mine would be Breakfast Club. I'd have to say Breakfast Club was my favorite. So
one
yeah. Well, this was awesome. This is just supposed to be a trial run, and we just like kept
kept it
rolling.
going
Yeah,
because that's how we are, Jerry. We just like get
that's we
together and we
are.
start talking about stuff. So
Yeah,
no, it's and if it weren't for you, like my husband would hear it and his eyes would roll in the back of his head. He's so over it. Now some of the stuff, we definitely talk about like Vermeer and stuff, but
yeah.
the blockchain and metaverse and AI stuff, he's just like, no, not
No interest
interested.
in that. Yeah.
Which is fine. So
Hey everyone. So thanks so much for joining us for this trial run. This is all your data. Any last words, Cassie?
no, just stay tuned. We'll be back.
Yeah, Bowie and Burns 5-minute chats every Friday.
There we go. Bye.
Bye, y'all.